So we are celebrating Ohigan, and this is celebrated twice a year, in autumn as summer is ending and fall begins, and now when winter is passing and spring is arriving. And this is the time, as we heard, when day and night are equal and the weather is even, and when nature is in perfect harmony. This is a time thus when we might realize the harmony within. And for us as Buddhists, it's a good time to reflect on impermanence as we honor and embrace the change of seasons and we celebrate the cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Right now, even though it's very cold here in Minnesota, nature is coming alive again. The birds are returning and singing. And here in Minnesota, the snow has pretty much melted and the grass is beginning to green. And soon the trees will be in bud, and there's hope and promise in the air. So for Ohigan, Higan means the other shore, or to reach the other shore. And during the autumnal and spring equinoxes, when we have an equal amount of daylight and night, we are all on the shore, and the other shore for us is the Pure Land. In Japan, the emphasis is placed on the 6 paramitas, or the precepts, which define or lay out the path to the other shore. And paramita means growing to perfection. And so I'm going to go through them again. The first one is about selfless sharing and giving and offering and generosity. The second one is about correct behavior and discipline of body, speech, and mind. The third one is patience and inclusiveness. The fourth is effort and perseverance. The fifth is meditation and contemplation. And the sixth one is wisdom, insight, and understanding, relinquishment of self. And even though in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, we know that we all reach the other shore because of the promise of the Amida Buddha made as expressed in the primal vow, we look at these precepts with gratitude for the Amida Buddha, who has realized the 6 paramitas for us. And so Ohigan is a time to contemplate with gratitude for the infinite wisdom and the selflessness and the compassion of the Amida Buddha. And the primal vow, or what Shinran Shonin called the fundamental vow, which recognizes our very humanness and tells us there is no need to strive to try so very hard. It reads in part, if when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings of all 10 quarters, with sincere mind entrusting themselves, aspiring to be born in my land and saying my name, perhaps even 10 times, should not be born there, may I not attain the supreme enlightenment. And so just contemplating spring, Ohigan is a welcome event for us here in Minnesota. We talked about how cold it is today, and it has been a very long winter. It has been the coldest winter in 8 years. So we're ready for spring. We had 10% more snow than usual. And in the city of Minneapolis, where I live, the sidewalks and the streets were perpetually icy all winter. We had a total of 46 days of winds gusting over 30 miles per hour. It's been the gustiest winter in 49 years. And so we are more than ready to leave behind the extreme of winter and embrace a day and a time that is about balance and harmony and hearken springtime and the opening up of new life and light. But it may be difficult to consider harmony and balance when the world we are living in seems so out of balance right now. And so how do we celebrate spring and new life and light when the world can feel so very dark right now? When there seems to be so much that is the opposite of new life and of harmony, when there's so much death and cruelty and chaos. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk and I discussed about how it felt to be living under a dark cloud. And in this time of celebrating Ohigan and spring and the light that is shining, it feels still as if the world might seem dark instead of light. And so how do we hold all of it? What do we do about it? I went to see a movie in a movie theater for the first time in more than 2 years, a couple of weeks ago. That was a very strange experience to be out in that way after being so careful during this pandemic and all the ways I've been trying to stay safe. But we saw the movie Cyrano, and it's based on a classic play about a man who has a very grotesque nose. And so because of his looks, he believes himself to be unworthy of love. And he believes no woman could ever love him. And especially Roxanne, the woman he loves from afar, that he could never, ever be considered. Now, in the movie version, it was changed so that the main character, Cyrano, instead of having a disfigured nose, he was a dwarf. And so he believed that because of this, the woman he pined for would never consider him. And it was a beautiful movie and such a nice change after all of this. It was filled with longing and selflessness. It was about giving of oneself. It was about compassion and sympathy, about deep, abiding love and loss and the sadness of life and of our very human ways of being in the world. And I was transported for 2 hours to 17th century Paris, and my own heart was filled with love and with thoughts of and ideas about compassion and empathy and loving fully and openly in life. But then when we emerged from the darkened theater, I felt suddenly blinded at first by the bright light when we stepped out the door. But then I saw the trash cans outside the door were overflowing with giant popcorn buckets and giant cups that had been filled with soda and big boxes of candy spilling out onto the floor. And I was jolted back into reality, and the excess of it all made me upset. Somehow I jumped in my mind and my heart to the Ukraine, and I immediately thought of the suffering of the people who have no water, no food, how families have been broken up, and the women and children have had to escape, and they've had to say goodbye to the men, not knowing if they would ever be reunited again. And I thought of the lives of so many that have been lost in the destruction of their beautiful country. And there in front of me were these buckets and boxes and cups of junk food, and it just seemed so wrong. And I didn't know how to hold all of that and that darkness that is happening now. And the fact that I was tossing my own bucket of popcorn into the pile. 2 weeks after our service, Chiemi led a discussion in which we talked about many of these distressing events that are going on right now. We talked about the Ukraine a bit, about how the death of George Floyd has revealed the systemic racism, hate crimes. We talked about the pandemic, and there was a lot of sadness expressed. And as I said, I don't know how to hold the injustice and the suffering of the Ukrainians. I don't know how to fix our society that exhibits such racism and hatred, greed and cruelty. I don't know how we can ease the heartache and fears we've undergone since the onset of this pandemic, which has changed our lives, or how to counteract human greed and self-centeredness. But maybe we do know something. I know that the historical Buddha, the Shakyamuni Buddha, went through all of this himself when he, after living a pampered and protected life, was overwhelmingly faced with the fact of sorrow, of pain, of suffering, of greed in humanity. Siddhartha Gautama was his name, and he was born a prince in the high plains of northern India. And as the revered son, he was expected to someday take the crown, and he was pampered and protected inside the palace grounds. He had a life that was one of ease and free of peril and sorrow. But one day he wandered outside the palace gates, and the first thing he saw was an old, thin, almost skeletal man. And for the first time in his life, he was shockingly confronted with the reality of aging and decline. And after that, he encountered a man who was very sick, which was something he had not seen before. And then he witnessed a funeral procession, and he was struck by the endless cycle of birth and death, of grief and suffering. He witnessed all of these events, the difficulty and the pain of being human, and he was at a loss of what to do about it, how to understand it all, and how to make sense of it, of how to live with it. And all of these surprising discoveries made Siddhartha determined to leave the comforts of his life and go out into the world to speak spiritual enlightenment regarding the condition of man. He sought to understand the cause of suffering and to alleviate it. And so, after much time and trying different spiritual practices, he settled himself one day under a large Bodhi tree, and he vowed to sit there until he came to an understanding, an awakening about it all. And he did, and he was enlightened. And he shared all, that life is connected with suffering. There is no getting around with that. And that we suffer because we don't even want to accept that truth. And it is when we can let go of our own greed and our desires to have things the way we want them to be that suffering ceases. And that it is in realizing and accepting the truth of impermanence that we can finally seize, to grasp, we can let go and live with an untroubled mind. Now, understanding that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt to witness all the pain. It doesn't hurt to experience the suffering that is going on right now, but it does allow us to recognize that this is not the anomaly. This is the result of human greed and human grasping. It is what it is to live here on earth. And so here's what I do know. We have one another, and we have the Sangha, where we can share our doubts, our worries. We have the Dharma for guidance and inspiration, and we have the promise of the Amida Buddha and the Nembutsu. And so at Ohigan, we contemplate the infinite life and the infinite light of the compassionate and generous heart of the Amida Buddha that reaches into our own minds and hearts and envelops us. Because nothing is asked of us except to accept the gift of the Amida Buddha as expressed in the primal vow, the gift of liberation from trying, from using our own power. And when we let go and embrace this gift, what we need to do is no longer the question. We know. For how can we be anything but moved to immense gratitude for the primal vow? And gratitude leads us to compassion. It actually leads us to fulfilling the 6 paramitas without effort, for it is our response to the Amida Buddha that leads us to be giving, to be patient, to be understanding, that leads us to compassion. Even during these dark times, when all appears so bleak, we can fully embrace the gift from the Amida Buddha, and in that embrace, how can anything but compassion arise? Forgiveness, kindness, humility, generosity, love, all are aspects of compassion, because compassion is about stepping outside of ourselves and into another's shoes. It's about looking deeply into the heart of another and having the profound understanding that we are all connected. We see how we are all interconnected. And with that understanding, we can plant the little seeds of compassion that spread and grow, or like a stone that is thrown into a pond and the waves ripple out further and further and further until we can no longer see the effect, but we know something has changed, something has happened. We know this even when we ourselves are witnessing or experiencing suffering and sorrow. even those during these times that seem so dark, even when it's overwhelming, even when we are reeling from the enormity of it all. I worked for a while as a hospital chaplain. Many of you know that several years ago, my teenage daughter died suddenly. And I started my work as a chaplain just 8 months after her death. And in a way, it was too soon for me to be doing that kind of work. It was a very terrible time for me because I was in deep grief. But it was also very timely. The patients, their loved ones, the staff, they all hurt, and they were ill, and some were dying. Some were stretched way too thin, and they received disturbing news. They had to make difficult decisions. They had to prepare to say goodbye. And I was ministering to them in their pain during a time when I hurt so badly. And sometimes, because someone was fearful or hurting or suffering, they would be very angry and at whoever walked in the door. Often they were angry at their doctors or their nurses, or if I happened to be the one to come in at a specific moment, they would direct their anger and their confusion and their distress at me. And there I was, carrying around such sorrow myself, and someone was swearing at me. But that's why my chaplaincy turned out to be so perfectly timed, because I needed to be there for my fellow human beings who were troubled and in difficulty. Yes, we can be there when we feel on top of the world and everything is going well, but we can also be there when the world feels very dark. And so in the midst of feeling my own pain, I felt theirs too. I felt their hurt and their suffering and their grief and their fatigue. And it didn't mean that my own suffering wasn't real, but I learned that my own sorrow and my own darkness, while personal, is also very universal. It's a reminder of how we are on each and all so very human. Because at the hospital, I learned in the midst of my own despair, I am not unique. We are the same. And the heroin addicts and the prostitutes who were in the hospital, they hurt. And the woman with HIV and the woman whose sister was dying, she was suffering. And the elderly man who was having his third limb amputated, and me. And I couldn't fix it for anyone. And they couldn't fix it for me, but I could listen and I could hold their hand. And I could understand the interconnectedness of all of us. Thich Nhat Hanh says, we are all leaves of one tree. We are all waves of one sea. So I'm giving this Dharma message from the home of my grandchildren. I'm staying with them this weekend while their parents are away. And I'm recalling another time many years ago when my Madeline, who is my teenage granddaughter, when she was 3 years old, she had been waking up all hours of the night and in the early morning, much to the dismay of her parents. And she would quietly creep into her mom and dad's room and crawl into bed with them. But none of them got any sleep because in actuality, Madeline was ready for the day. And so she would begin to chatter away. And her parents tried everything to get her to stay in bed, and they had become quite distressed. They firmly told her, you absolutely cannot get up so early. And they put a digital clock beside her bed, and they showed her the numbers, and they wrote on a piece of paper 630 and taped it right above the clock. And they explained to her that she had to stay in the room until the clock said 630. But she still wandered in throughout the night. And so I spent a Saturday night there while my son and daughter-in-law had a weekend getaway. And early in the morning before dawn, I woke to see a nervous little Madeline creeping in on all fours. And so I sat up and I held out my arms and I said, good morning, my most beautiful, precious granddaughter in all the world. And then I invited her into bed and we chatted and we snuggled. And she said to me, Grandma, you love me even when it's not 6:30. Loving, accepting, and opening your arms or your heart to another, even when it's not 6:30, is compassion. Even when it's not convenient, even in dark times such as these when we are all in difficulty. We can remember always the primal vow and the great and precious gift we have been given. And we can feel the enormity of that and embrace it. We can answer that gift with gratitude. In these dark times when each of us may be feeling confused or disoriented or scared or alone, we can open our arms and our hearts and hold one another up. And these are the seeds we as Buddhists plant in this world during this spring season, this time of Ohigan, this time of life and light. These are the ripples in the pond, and it takes no effort because it has simply been given to us. I'll close with a quote from J.R.R. Tolkien. The world is indeed full of peril, and in it there are many dark places. But still there is much that is fair. And though in all lands love is now mingled with grief, it still grows, perhaps the greater. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you.